Well, thanks to Chris for that introduction. Thanks to HRC for including me. Thanks to Kelly. I hope Motherhood the second time round is fantastic. And thanks to all of you who are having the real transformative effect, because it is the activism of people in this room, the people you inspire, the people who wish they were here and can't make it, but especially all of you who actually did make the effort to make it, who are going to save the world. So thanks to all of you for that. I'm old enough to remember the fantasy that if we could solve 3 problems, the military, marriage, and the HIV crisis, queer people would be safe. Right now, trans service members are expelled. Marriage equality is threatened, especially by Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. HIV is resurgent, especially among disadvantaged populations. And so I find, even with this passage of time, that queerness and despair too often keep holding hands. The CDC, which is hardly an activist operation, found during the Biden administration that 1 out of 4 queer high school students in the US made a viable suicide attempt each year. And the numbers are rising. The week of the 2024 election calls to the Trevor Project for young queer people considering suicide were up 700%. A friend of mine who worked at a suicide hotline described receiving a call from someone who said, I'm 14 and I just came out to my parents. And my friend said, well, how did it go? And he said, my father said, this is a Christian household. Your mother and I are going to leave the house now. I'm putting my gun on the kitchen table. You know what you should do. And this week, a leaked Trump budget showed plans to cut the LGBTQ+ services from the National Suicide Hotline. The people we serve are dying from this moment's cruelty. Not just saddened, not just frustrated, but dying. A father called me from the ER recently after his queer son's 7th suicide attempt. I suggested an alternate facility where I thought they could access better services, but he told me that they had tried that facility and been told that there was a 2-month waiting list. The receptionist there later explained to me that this complete falsehood invited less anger than telling people the truth, that there was just no room for them. And one mother whom I interviewed recently, who had helped her queer son embrace his identity in brave and courageous and remarkable ways, recounted to me how he nonetheless jumped to his death in front of her. And when I described some of the stories I've just told you, and said how other adolescents had experienced abuse at home, and told her she shouldn't blame herself, she replied, but those boys are still alive, aren't they? That's not just data. That's grief. And that's what it sounds like when a generation cries out. A friend of mine who was born in Nairobi sought to categorize as hate groups the American evangelical churches that consistently draft foreign legislation that imposes extreme punishments, including the death penalty, on queer people. She couldn't find a single supporter in the American government. So look, we all know there is disdain for queerness out there, but more perniciously, there is disdain for activism itself. And part of what has brought every indecent regime the world has ever known to power has been the perception that expressing opposition is somehow counterproductive, not merely a waste of time, but a dangerous and bad strategy. I recently was talking to someone who had spent some years in the CIA and been involved at very high levels in discussions with various presidents. And he told me that the most common problem in the Situation Room, and I use his phrasing, is people who are so in love with identifying the problem that they don't try to solve it. So we're all here to solve it. In 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty. Some of you may know it. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores, send these, the tempest-tossed, to me. She was talking, at the time, about impoverished, dirty Eastern European Jews like my great-grandparents. But the principle was a lot broader. In one of her essays, she later wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." Recently discovered letters show that Emma Lazarus was also queer. When my parents' generation learned her poem by heart, no one told them, because no one knew, that the words that symbolized America were about freedom that included us in this room. The stories we have all grown up with haven't just been incomplete, they've been redacted. And now we look as major AI models, including many content moderation systems, have been trained on data sets that filter out queer identities and especially trans voices. It's a quiet obliteration that's shaping how invisibility is even now being coded into the future for far too many of us. Righteousness entails both outrage and enactment of that outrage. There are people in the US, many who need food and housing and health care, and whose situation may be so difficult and so desperate that enactment is beyond them. But most others can, yet don't, take action. And what they don't know is that self-interest is often inimical not only to love, but also to happiness. That only emotional cowardice squanders power on assertions of powerlessness. I've worked for many years as a journalist, and when I reported from Rwanda, I interviewed not only the victims who were the subject of what I was writing, but also the perpetrators of the genocide, most of whom were in prison. It was a few years after the genocide had taken place. Asked why they had hacked their neighbors to death with machetes, they said, it just seemed like the normal thing. And they said, I don't know why I did that. And that was a lot more terrifying than the ideology that I had encountered, because acquiescence costs far more lives than conviction, and genocide occurs not primarily because of those who envision it, but because of all of those who tolerate it. In the autumn of 2022, I was invited by Cook Children's Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, to lecture on youth suicide. And 2 weeks beforehand, they asked if they could see my notes so they could prepare some questions for after my talk. And 3 days before the lecture day, having looked at those notes, they asked me to drop the one story I had of a trans boy who had died by suicide. I went to Fort Worth. I ignored that request, and I included the vetoed anecdote. And when I finished it, I said, laws that take decisions about children's mental and personal health and identity away from parents and doctors and those children themselves are not only ignorant, but also stigmatizing. I said, and those of you who are sitting here in support of such laws have blood dripping from your hands. This wasn't a convention of ill-informed people. This was a children's hospital. And something was killing children in the catchment area of that children's hospital. But fear of offending funders seemed to require ignoring the problem. And if I talk about suicide as I did in opening this conversation, that is only the visible tip of the iceberg of self-hatred and shame that gets bred into people through these behaviors and that occupies our community far too much, despite our rhetoric of pride. I was detained by ICE when I returned from travel last week. One agent lifted a jacket from my suitcase and said, "Are you actually going to wear this?" I had to be polite. You're helpless when you were detained at the border. So I made a little joke, and I avoided acting like who I am, just as I did in middle school. It was the cost of staying safe, and I was eventually dismissed without charges after more than an hour with 9 agents grilling me. And few people who haven't shared these experiences would guess what it cost me, what it costs all of us when we have to erase the self-respect that we have achieved over decades. So if I put aside emotion so that I can talk in a cool, reasonable way, which there's a great deal of pressure to do, some of it articulated just now from this very stage, if I turn into, to use J.D. Vance's ugly phrase, a normal gay guy, then I think I'm betraying myself and this movement. Peter Thiel and his cohort seem to mistake tolerance for equality, and in doing so, they betray every one of us every single day. I will not sublimate what I feel to conform to this strange corporatized etiquette that seems to have taken over American politics, because the slavish focus on stoical reason is what underpins the brutality that is focused against us. And so I want to say to all of you activists in this room, don't stop feeling. Your sadness and your rage and even your misery are weapons, and obscuring them achieves not peace, but defeat. A friend said recently to me, an immigrant who had come to this country to escape the oppression of queer people in his country, I already knew that almost half the world hated me without even having met me. And since this election, I know that it's more than half the world. And my anger makes me so exhausted. And I can only think that sometimes action is the most restful of the available options. So radical ideas, and our safety now seems like a radical idea, are not based in reason, and they're not based in realism. It's only by being unreasonable and unrealistic that we can help those ideas graduate into rationality. This Trump dictatorship did not emerge from reason and realism. but from fictions repeated over and over again until they struck an alarming majority of Americans as true. Our progress will rise from actual truth, but our refusal to be reasonable is how we win. Our problem is not what got called after the Second World War the banality of evil. It's the presumption that current manifestations of evil are somehow intractable, that we have to just accept them instead of constantly fighting back against them. And when I say that, I'm not talking only about the points on which we as an organization fight explicitly, on which all of you, I believe, fight explicitly. Questions that matter to each of us: when trans youth should receive care, whether puberty blockers should be easy to access, how to negotiate questions of regret, and to acknowledge that regret is something every human being feels about some adolescent decisions. I'm not talking only about questions of athletic teams or bathrooms, because these matters are all components of the primary question that is once more on the chopping block, which is whether our lives, our minds, and our emotional experiences are worth as much as those of the straight people who rule the world. A friend whose mother had been weeping for 3 weeks after he came out finally told her, "I like being gay so much that if I am reincarnated, I want to be gay again." And at that point, she began to laugh, and she said, "Well, if you're so happy, why should I be so sad?" And I want to see us create a world in which that kind of happiness is available to everyone the month they come out. Angela Davis said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." And our exercise of power relies on engaging everyone else, saying over and over, there is murderous justice afoot, and you can stop it. Sitting with grieving parents as I do this research on suicide, I understood that their children's despair rose from structural phobias like those deployed against our trans brothers and sisters. And while an equal, fully equal, economically equal society may be difficult or impossible fully to achieve, there will always be experiences that are luxuries. Having your children alive is not a luxury. And most of the queer children who killed themselves didn't have to die. They didn't have to live in a world that made them wish they were dead. So our purpose is not to beg for safety, but to claim it. As individuals, we may be scattered along a spectrum of powerness, but collectively, we can preserve the freedoms for which we fought so hard. In fact, we can, to borrow from Emma Lazarus's work, strive to be all of us free, knowing that until we succeed at that, we are none of us free. Thank you.